Hi, everyone, and welcome to All Things Breastfeeding, where we talk about happenings that are going on in the breastfeeding world. I'm Barbara Robertson, and I am the host of All Things Breastfeeding. And instead of being joined by Jessica today, we have a guest joined by Nancy Moorbacher. Yeah, and so Nancy, she is quite famous in the lactation world. She has written numerous books. She's a presenter from all over the world, and we have been working together on the next edition of Breastfeeding Answers. And so Nancy and I have gotten to know each other very well. And in our process of updating the chapter in Breastfeeding Answers, second edition, third edition, fourth edition now.
Third edition.
It's going to be third edition. That's right.
Third
It's
edition.
PA3. We have been looking at the updates on jaundice and hypoglycemia in infants. And so, Nancy, what are some of the big things that we found? At first, we thought, oh, this isn't going to be, especially jaundice, it wasn't going to be that big of a deal. But then some major updates have happened.
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2022, it turns out the American Academy of Pediatrics updated its clinical practice guidelines, and it made some changes that actually bring it in line with some other organizations in other parts of the world. Because up until these new guidelines, the number 20 was really significant to them. 20 milligrams per deciliter, that's the measurement that's commonly used here in the US, was considered to be the upper limit of where they wanted to see the bilirubin levels rise. Now, bilirubin is, of course, it's a byproduct of the breakdown of extra red blood cells that happens when newborns are born and start breathing oxygen. And that's what causes it's a yellow pigment. So that's what causes the skin to turn yellow, which is what jaundice is. But they set the upper limit at 20 because they were concerned if babies had too high a level of bilirubin in their blood, that it can cause very serious problems.
Right.
It can cause neurological problems. It can even kill babies if it gets high enough. So they set that 20 as their upper limit. And for all the years, I started helping breastfeeding families in 1982. So it's been more than 40 years now. During all those years, 20 was like their magic number in terms of how high they wanted to see it go. So that actually has changed with these new guidelines, which was really astounding to me. And the reason that they changed them is because they discovered that this guideline was a little too unnecessarily conservative, because really 20 isn't the number at which damage can happen. It's really more like 30 milligrams per deciliter. And so they came to the conclusion that under certain circumstances, it would be okay if babies' levels got above 20. So, the other thing that they did, which was different, that wasn't true in the last guidelines, is that they have different levels of safe bilirubin based on the baby's gestational age. So every week that the baby is born earlier, the levels are different. So whether a baby is term, early term, preterm, makes a huge difference in terms of what bilirubin levels are safe, because babies who are born earlier, their bodies aren't really capable of processing the bilirubin very well. So it's, the safe levels are lower. So between the like, for example, for the term babies, they can get as high as 22 milligrams per deciliter. Some of it has to do with the age of the baby as well. So that wouldn't be true during the first, let's say, 3 days. But after 3 days, it can go a little bit higher and still be considered safe.
Let's break down some of the risk factors.
Okay.
And so, because it's not always the risk isn't always the same depending on certain situations.
Right.
And it is nice that they've moved, the United States has moved more in line with, as you said, the rest of the world. And our families, they often say, oh, the baby had a level of 15, or a baby had 11. So they don't know exactly what that means. They just have that one number.
Right.
And so you mentioned gestational age. So basically, the earlier the baby is gestationally, the lower that number becomes, the threshold that we're worried about. Okay. And then also the age of the baby. I think this is really critical too, because
Absolutely.
on day one, we
Hmm.
expect X levels. Day two, we get worried.
Hmm.
And then we expect the jaundice levels to kind of peak around day 4, 5, usually.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
around
And,
there.
and so if a baby on day two has like a jaundice level of 18, you might be like, oh, well, that's not 20 or 22, but we're more concerned about that.
Right. How quickly it's rising makes a difference. And
Hmm.
also, as you say, the baby's age, because typically it doesn't get high enough to be concerning until a baby's at least 3 days old. Of course, we know there's different types of newborn jaundice.
Right.
And, if a baby does have jaundice within the first day, that's not normally the kind that we're talking about.
Hmm.
What we're talking about is what's called physiological or normal jaundice.
Hmm.
And, babies who have it much earlier usually have a jaundice that's caused by other physical factors. It's called pathological jaundice.
Right. And another piece about jaundice is that when you get up in those higher levels, even though it's not dangerous, like it's not going to cause permanent damage, it makes the baby sleepy,
Right.
which
It
makes them
does.
feed more poorly.
Right. Right.
So making sure these babies are fed is a critical, critical piece.
Right. Right. And that's something that the American Academy of Pediatrics is really emphasizing. It was wonderful to see in these new clinical practice guidelines that they were also quoting the Academy of Breastfeeding Medicine, which
Mm,
is an organization of physicians that, work hard to promote breastfeeding and come up with clinical protocols, around various topics. So their focus is really on breastfeeding. And it was good to see that they were quoting some of the protocols and some of the statements from the ABM as well.
right, because I think there's a misunderstanding that breastfeeding advocates are somehow willing to sacrifice the safety of the baby.
Yeah, that's
For
definitely
this,
not the
right?
case.
The first rule of lactation is
Mm.
feed the baby,
Feed the
and
baby right.
yeah,
And one
yeah.
one of the things that the Academy of Breastfeeding Medicine, one in their statement on jaundice, the protocol, they talk about how it's insufficient milk jaundice. In other words,
Right.
what causes these high levels in term babies is
Mhm.
typically underfeeding. If
Right.
a baby's not getting the milk that they need, then that can lead to jaundice. And so the idea is, making sure the baby is fed is a really critical aspect
Hmm.
of dealing with jaundice.
Right, and then we used to focus on the diapers, like, oh, if the baby's pooping, they're getting rid of the
Right.
bilirubin, which I think it's more if the baby's pooping a lot, it's a sign they're getting the food, which is
Right.
getting rid of the jaundice.
Because in the last edition of Breastfeeding Answers, that one of the things that surprised me was there was research to show that it really isn't about the stools, because
Mhm.
researchers looked at the stools of formula-fed and breastfed
Right.
babies and discovered that actually the formula-fed babies had fewer stools, but they had lower levels of bilirubin.
Right, right. And, when you have a new parent, especially a first-time parent, they might think the baby's feeding, but they actually might not be. And so we do,
Right.
jaundice is something that's serious and we want to keep an eye on, but it's nice to
Absolutely.
know that we have a little more wiggle room um,
Right.
than we used to, because
So,
yeah, having families having to go back to the hospital,
mhm.
um, for treatments, it's a traumatic experience for them. And so if we can
Yeah.
avoid some of that, that's great.
So the good news is these clinical practice guidelines are open access, so
Mhm.
anybody can go online and look for them. There, it was published in Pediatrics,
Mhm.
and the lead author is Kemper, Kemper, first name Alex,
Mhm.
middle initial R.
Yep.
So if you look that up on PubMed, you can bring it up and you can download it, which I think is really useful.
Absolutely. So again, the AAP, and it was 2022,
Exactly. And
and
then
in pediatrics.
in pediatrics. And what was also interesting was this year, early this year, we had another study that was published that actually incorporated these new guidelines. And they wanted to compare and see what the outcomes were like with the new guidelines compared with the old ones. And
Hmm.
what they discovered was that actually the number of babies needing phototherapy decreased by 47%
Wow.
using these new guidelines. And the number of painful blood tests, they do these heel sticks
Right.
on newborns, decreased by 23%. And so it's clear that it makes a big difference. And we know as lactation people that phototherapy can often lead to issues with breastfeeding
Right.
because oftentimes nursing parents feel pressured to not take the baby out from under the lights
Right.
to nurse, and that it still can really interfere when milk production is being established.
We've also found that there's evidence that once a baby has been diagnosed as having high bilirubin levels, having high jaundice levels, that the parents change their view of the baby, and they see
Right,
their baby as more fragile,
right.
not as robust, and
They're
they
more
can
likely
be.
to take the baby to the emergency room.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of consequences. And
Right.
so again, having some more wiggle room.
Yeah.
Another thing we found when we were looking at the research was there were a couple of studies that indicated that actually skin to skin contact
Mm-hmm.
helps prevent higher bilirubin levels.
Right. Because I think we know that what skin to skin contact does is it reduces stress for the baby,
Hmm.
physical stress for the baby.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
we see that both with jaundice and with hypoglycemia, the more time newborns spend in skin to skin contact, the more it lowers risk for those things.
Yeah. And that's a wonderful segue. Now we're going to move into talking about hypoglycemia.
Okay, well, let me
And
just say before we move
okay.
into that, I just want to mention the author of the second article that I
Mhm.
mentioned. It also appeared in Pediatrics. It's not open access, but you might want to look it up anyway. It's Sarathy, Sarathy, first name Leela,
Mhm.
Leela. So that's the article that looked at the results of using these new guidelines. And they actually examined results in more than 22,000 babies. So it's quite an impressive study.
And that, if I recall, was 2024. So it's a very
Yes,
recent.
2024.
Hmm.
So when
And
I say this year, someone may be watching it in another year.
right.
So it's important to clarify.
Yeah. And if you are listening to this as a podcast and you go to LactaLearning.com on our podcast and blog, you will find our show notes with links to these
Mhm.
studies. If you're watching this on YouTube, you're going to have to do your work.
Yeah.
All right. So wonderful. This is just such good news. It's nice to feel like there's kind of a worldwide consensus. Now,
Mhm.
hypoglycemia, we still don't have consensus.
No.
We have our recommendations, but each individual hospital seems to kind of have their different thresholds and things like that.
Yes. Yes.
But the treatment of jaundice has been shifting.
Yeah.
And so
For
talk about that.
hypoglycemia.
Yeah,
Yeah, the
for jaundice,
hypoglycemia
right, for
treatment.
hypoglycemia, sorry.
Yeah, well, I had an interesting experience last summer. I was speaking at a live event in Dallas, Texas.
Hmm.
And during the break, someone came up and said, "Here, come and sit down next to me." And she said, "I just want to tell you a story." And turns out she was a researcher, and because she had read about what I had said in the second edition of Breastfeeding Answers about this treatment, which is the use of oral dextrose gel, a little
Hmm.
bit of gel that you put in a baby's cheek, which is an alternative to formula. And what was great about that, I learned this when I was working with a local hospital who was trying to increase rates of exclusive breastfeeding, that one of the huge advantages of this is it does not interfere with exclusive breastfeeding.
Right.
But we have Cochrane reviews and other studies that show it's actually quite an effective way to
Hmm.
treat hypoglycemia in a baby.
Hmm.
But what this lactation consultant was telling me was that her research team took a look at the actual products that are used, these oral dextrose gels, because she said some of the studies she looked at, the results weren't all the same. And she
Right,
was trying to
right.
figure out if there was something about the product that was different. And what she discovered was that some of the brands, the container was not the level of dextrose was not the same throughout the container.
Hmm.
Now, if you're using that with an adult, for example, that doesn't really matter because you use the whole container with an
Right.
adult. But if you're talking about using with a newborn for
Hmm.
hypoglycemia, sometimes they only use a portion of the tube. And
Right.
so what they discovered was some of it might be, high in dextrose, and some of it might have less dextrose than is actually needed to treat the hypoglycemia.
Yeah.
So she said that explained to her why some of the studies might show different results, and she just wanted the word to get out. So I'm doing my part here to get the word out so that anyone who's using those products or anyone who's studying them, might be aware that for some of the brands, there could be, an uneven distribution of the glucose within the container.
Well, and I did some looking around recently because I was interested in what do these containers look like. And most of them, are like a small little gel and you kind of squeeze it in.
Like a vial.
Right, a little vial and you squeeze it in. And as you say, for an adult, you would squeeze the whole thing in. And many hospitals have kind of taken this adult product and they're using it for infants.
Right.
But I also found some products now that are being designed just for infants.
Right. And that's ideally what we would want.
Right.
So that you wouldn't have any of these variables that might influence how effective they are.
Yeah. And so I think this is great because, as you say, we're not interrupting or interfering with the breastfeeding. Because again, we want our babies to be safe. We want our babies to be healthy. But we also, if we can avoid interfering with breastfeeding, great. That's what we want to do.
I've had some people question, does it affect the microbiome? I don't know the answer to that question. But I know certainly formula
affects the microbiome.
Impacts the microbiome. So it's an alternative to that.
Right. I would think it would interfere less, but you never, again, we don't have the answer to that.
Yeah.
Well, so if you are enjoying this kind of contact, Nancy and I are working really hard on a lot of things. Again, the next edition of Breastfeeding Answers, but also we've created many, many courses together.
Yes.
We have a 95-hour course, we have a 50-hour course, we have a 45-hour course, and then a bunch of small courses that are perfect for recertification or if you're just interested. So we have these available, and then we have some exciting news, don't we, Nancy?
Yes, we do. We just got approved for nursing contact hours.
That's right. And so through the Montana Nursing Association, we are now approved for nursing contact hours for most of our combo programs that we have, our courses. And so you can look on our website and it will indicate which ones are and which ones are not. But if it has both Nancy and I's name on it, minus the book groups, it probably is now you can get lactation CERPs and nursing contact hours. So always trying to expand our offerings to help you better meet your educational needs. So if you enjoy this content, again, like to stay up to date with things, consider checking out our courses. Well, thank you, Nancy, for joining us and sharing these updates on this really important subjects. And again, if you're listening to our podcast, All Things Breastfeeding, you can find that on your favorite podcast listening device, or you can go to the LactaLearning.com website and go to our blog and podcast page, and you can find the show notes for this, which will include the links to the studies that we've been talking about. Well, thanks for joining us. Yeah, you're welcome. Always good to see you.